Yeah, it's a little after 1. Let's go around the board and identify ourselves for record.
Patrick Flood.
Jennifer Johnson.
Bill Evans.
Ernie Hall. Tim Steele.
Pete Peterson.
Dick Training.
L.B. Green.
This meeting's on an Anchorage Industrial Land Assessment. So we'll turn with administration. Thanks for doing this for us.
Thank you. Thank you for showing up in an off week. And guys, this is the only work session we have today. I'm Tom Davis, Municipal Planning. To reintroduce Bill Reed with Cardinal and John Sussman, Planning Director. Yes, I have here two of our Industrial Advisory Committee members have arrived. Phil Steyer from Chugach Electric and, of course, Tim Potter. So,
Thank you.
so what I'm going to do is give you a brief update, and then Bill Reed will lead us into the main part of today's discussion. Last month, I guess it's now 2 months ago, the first work session occurred about this industrial lands assessment, where we went over the main draft finding of the industrial study. And so what I'm going to briefly do here is explain how we've responded to the comments we received in December at the work session, as well as at the advisory committee meeting in December. We're progressing towards completing the project. The project has 3 objectives. First is to evaluate what our current industrial economic uses are and the market forecast for those uses through the year 2035. And secondly, to determine the adequacy of our remaining industrial land base to meet the needs of that forecasted industrial economy through 2035 and beyond. And thirdly, subject of today's meeting is to suggest very broad level policy strategy options for dealing with scarcity of land for industrial uses in context of scarcity of land for other uses in the fall. The reason why we are coming back is not because we forgot to tell you something last time, but last time the advisory committee had yet to meet and discuss the policy options, the draft options in the back of the draft report. And the advisory committee had the opportunity since then, and so much of what Bill Reed is going to discuss with you today is going to reflect the conversation that the advisory committee had on Monday. The advisory committee has provided us with a great public service. They have met 4 times over the past year or so, and have probably given more than a day or 2 of their time. And they provided a lot of technical information about the market from the brokers, from the users, and as well as some of the public utilities and major transportation facilities were also represented. The policy discussion was most helpful for us, and what we would like to do before I leave it off to Bill is to give you some update on some of the items that were raised in December, as well as some new information that we received about the land supply. We are attempting to follow up on determining what are the traded uses among the industrial uses. What are the uses? It's called traded sectors, but basically the sectors that provide net export, help drive Anchorage's economy. Some of the key industrial uses among all the industrial uses that we found in the inventory. The production uses, which together make up the majority of the industrial land use outside of the airports. The distribution and warehousing uses that were found in the inventory, and then the supporting industrial uses. And so one of the questions coming out of the study or further review is more clearly identifying the traded sectors. One of the comments we received in December was regarding our vacant land supply estimate. There is a desire to take the vacant land supply that we have identified, the vacant lands, partially vacant lots, and really underutilized lots in the industrial districts, and focus down on those lots without any peak constraints, that are large enough. One of the planning and zoning commissioners that was with the work session last month suggested we look at lots larger than an acre, a 3 to 5 acre range. So we are developing an estimate of what we are calling the Tier 1 industrial land supply, where the development costs are lower, the site size seems adequate for typical Anchorage industrial business, and also the land we believe will be available. There's more certainty about it will be available for industrial use. It's not committed to another use. In response to those comments, we have a working draft estimate of the Tier 1 land supply. This is the estimate of land supply we've been using, and which basically is the same as what you saw last month. Bill will use it here, showing his updated land demand supply reconciliation. But when you remove some of the smaller parcels, some of the parcels with environmental issues, some of the parcels that we're not sure will be available, you get more of a low-range estimate of supply, which is much lower. We have heard from two of the main landowners since December. Joint Base Allendorf Richardson commented that it recommends that we not hang our hats on including a parcel that may be subject to a land exchange, the J. Bear's Boniface parcel, in the land supply estimate. Here it's showing 77 acres of T-zone land at the northeast corner of Boniface and Glen Highway that may or may not be a part of a land exchange. If it is, it could come into the bowl at up to 77 acres of land supply, and J. Bear's recommending that we don't hang our hats on that, so this low ball estimate excludes that property. The other piece of information we received was we have been consulting with Eklutna Inc. And Eklutna Inc., of course, is a major landowner in Shipiak Eagle River, and its lands are included in all of these sub-areas. They have recently changed their estimate of land supply in the Powder Reserve. Basically, that part of the Powder Reserve, here's the railroad, so from the Glen Highway, downtown Eagle River. So they have estimated that in the more remote portions of the Powder Reserve, there could be a fair amount of low-density, low-intensity industrial use land available in the future. So basically, we're seeing possibly even lower supply than we had thought in the bowl, and higher supply in Shipiak Eagle River in areas that do not currently have and may not have water wastewater service. Before I leave off with the policy discussion, just want to put this study in context and what it is. It is following on two previous studies about two other major land uses in the bowl, not recently, which also had technical advisory committees. I know Ernie was on the advisory committee for the housing market analysis as well. This is a study. It's a technical study. It's not a plan. It doesn't require action. It is providing information for future planning and other efforts in the municipality for dealing with scarcity of land and balancing those needs. This study does not recommend specific areas be industrial or not. It is just providing a general policy, macro-level policy suggestions. Later efforts are intended to try to deal with resolving the balance between scarce land supply between different uses that make up our land use economy. And so I will leave off with that for my briefing, and we'll go ahead and turn things over to Bill.
Yeah, let me see if there's any questions from some members. Any questions? Jennifer, anything? Patrick?
No.
Please go ahead.
Thank you. Okay. So, quick review of some numbers based on some of the revised supply analysis that had been done since the last meeting. We were able to brief you on all of this. Let's see. Yeah, okay. So, basically, the main finding here is that with all the different changes in the supply of potential industrially zoned land or land that isn't currently industrially zoned, but potentially could be candidate for industrial use in the future, starting with the Tier 1, really truly buildable amount of land that's industrially zoned in the Bowl and in Chuquiaquiga River. Basically, over the next 20 years, what we find is that if the economy grows fairly normally, you're short about 380 acres of currently zoned industrial land in the municipality. If the economy stinks for 20 years on average, you're still cutting it close, actually, but you marginally have some left over after 20 years, and that's a land that's currently largely unconstrained, very suitable for development soon. No huge major obstacles, as Tom was pointing out a little while ago. If we take a look at land numbers in terms of supply of land that does have site constraints, the high range supply of land, currently zoned industrial land is still 75 acres short over a 20-year period. So you're still talking about a situation where, whether you're looking at land that's truly buildable or land that needs work or needs reconsideration. In terms of currently industrially zoned land, you have a shortage over a 20-year period. Again, with poor performance for 20 years, you have plenty of industrially zoned land, presently industrially zoned land, but who wants to plan for or see that happen, basically? But at least if the economy goes that way, what you do and don't have. And the main finding really here is that it's going to be very worthwhile and part of policy consideration to take a look at, and in a very judicious manner, take a look at different lands that are currently designated PLI and T. Public land institutional and T is transition, right? That's make sure I got that right. There are sites out there currently so designated that are going to be worthwhile taking a look at. There's a lot of land out there that, particularly on the institutional side, that likely has long-term plans by major institutions here. That's not what we're looking at here. It really is selective, judicious sites in different areas that really long-term probably don't have plans for them and would be worthwhile considering. So that needs to be part of the mix is basically one of the recommendations, is taking a look at those lands. And just a bit of a refresher on, as Tom said, this study really is just to help you be as informed of industrial land issues as other uses. The job of balancing all of these land needs, and all of them are supply constrained over the next 20 years, for the most part. Right now, what the purpose of this study in part was also to validate the value of industrial land and keeping it, or at least ensuring industrial land supply in the municipality. Some major cities, on the West Coast certainly have identified an economic development priority that, their industry sectors, they're moving out wholesale, have been to the suburbs, and it's not worthwhile keeping industrial land as a high priority. Other jurisdictions, very much like Portland or Seattle, who have major port investment, major waterway transportation infrastructure investment, very much like here, those types of major central cities have all prioritized industrial land because of the value of their core industries. And so, for Anchorage, we would echo that sentiment that you really do have core industrial sectors that are highly valuable, and ensuring that they can continue to expand is very important long term. Let's see. And the main reason being, really for taking a look at industrial and prioritizing it potentially for certain decisions in terms of balancing your land supply. Industrial is the most vulnerable from a cost perspective, from a usage perspective, for being priced out versus other uses. Industrial can't build up for the most part. I mean, you can build warehouses 2-3 stories, but by and large, you have the least flexibility because of the very specific business operation that occurs on the site, and they typically are less. They typically have more land area around with them for storage, truck access. You can't build up like residential, and you can't redevelop them and reconcentrate like commercial can in many instances. So, and certainly like office as well. So as time goes on, and as you take a look at these issues and begin to balance them later process, all reasons why it's worthwhile to remember the value of industrial and how unique it is, and that it is the most vulnerable land uses to others out bidding for sites based on the cost and price basis. So as we led into the policy discussion and the most recent technical advisory committee meeting, the really kind of the big first question regarding what type of policies would be suitable throughout the municipality, because there's a big distinction between Anchorage Bowl and Chugiaki River, of course, in terms of quantity of land, type, infrastructure, investment, existing businesses, all of that. And the big question that we kind of first put up before the advisory committee was, really long term, how strong or how suitable is Chugiaki River as a place for expansion or relocation? How easy, how fluid is that going to be over time? How, for different sectors and industries, how realistic is that to occur over time, based on where population is and based on land, site quality, and future transportation infrastructure in particular. And really, and based on that answer, if Anchorage Bowl is still long run going to be the strong preferred location for a number of industries, that's going to lead to, we'll likely need to recommend more policies related to how to help industrial land, maintain industrial land supply in the bowl. If Chugiaki River ends up being a kind of a location where a lot of movement can occur and will occur naturally, a reasonably substitutable location long term, then it's not going to be necessary to be as protective or as strong or have as many policies regarding industrial land supply in the bowl versus north. And really, in discussing this, the technical advisory committee really, there was pretty general agreement for the foreseeable future. Anchorage is going to be strongly preferred for most sectors. There are a few that are already taking a look at or making limited investment north in sites, but by and large, it's going to be a while probably before Chugiaki River becomes sees a lot of true amount of flexibility with regard to location. And a big part of that has to do with how fast the Matsuparo grows. As that continues to occur, Chugiaki River becomes more and more strategically located centrally on the Glen Highway. But it's going to be a while before that really, really happens, that gravity happens, because there's still so many more customers in the bowl and critical delivery times for a lot of the businesses that have the need for industrial land. Current industry mix. So these 4 bullet points really represent the kind of the 4 major policies that got the most discussion, seem to be of the highest value and the highest priority, at least in terms of what the technical advisory committee identified and chewed on and kind of wanted us to hear. Let's see, make sure the button. Again, getting back to the point kind of made earlier, judiciously identify various land sites with PLI or T designation zoning, and take a look at redesignating, rezoning in the future. Current supply just isn't going to cut it under really any sensitivity analysis, so that has to be part of the mix, part of the toolbox. One of the big things that we talked about is at all possible, when taking a look at the suitability of industrial land, currently zoned or otherwise, add some sort of filter in order to identify sites, areas that are really truly development cost constrained for soil quality, peat issues. A lot of the industrial sites, or a number of industrial sites, particularly in the South Sea area, and the commercial land study that was done before, identified this very same issue related to the conflict between commercial and industrial. Site development costs are so high because of peat extraction and gravel replacement, all that goes into that, that there are, anecdotally, there were development concepts that have been, went through pro forma, and even if the land was absolutely free, as is, the project didn't pencil. So part of the issue in terms of identifying what truly is industrial land versus what absolutely should be considered something under a flexible zoning designation or will likely go commercial is, only commercial retail, for instance, can pay a price high enough for a piece of land and recover all that cost of development and still make money. It's about the only use that can do that now here for a number of different places. So including that filter and trying to recognize in terms of the evaluation you do in the zoning plan map process, some sort of filter along those lines. Review municipal codes regarding development costs, specifically to industrial use. There was anecdotes cited about how, perhaps in building code or elsewhere, there are certain requirements that end up making different types of industrial development that could be less expensive, potentially unnecessarily expensive. So there are areas and opportunities potentially to review that. And then there was also, there's also mention of reviewing code for allowing different uses or flexibility in conditional use. And Tom, I'll let you talk a little bit more about that regarding residential and some other things, if you want to go ahead.
Well, we've got a question from Mr.
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Mr. Flynn, sir.
I'm sitting next to our resident Title 21 expert. But my recollection is in the new Title 21, you can't use industrial land for commercial activity.
That's not true.
Do we take that out?
We've got many additional uses for industrial land, yes.
Well, it seems to me that if we have a dearth of industrial lands available, a flexible zoning designation is probably a negative approach in that we make it that much harder to maintain a sufficient industrial land base. Why would we take that approach? Is the idea that we'll get someone to develop it commercially and then come back and redo it industrially?
There is another slide of policy. It's after this. Get to identifying certain areas for greater protection for industrial uses, and Bill will get into that. The Title 21 rewrite did provide more protections for industrial uses in the I-2 district as opposed to the I-1. What we found in the inventory process was that there, first of all, we learned quite a bit about the whole range of industrial uses and sectors out there, far more than we knew when, of course, we rewrote the code. And we also found some other uses that in some ways were compatible with and even supported industrial use. For example, there were caretaker apartments, or maybe there was an owner over a business had his apartment over the business. To some degree, there was some compatible non-industrial, even residential use in some cases where, as I recall, we prohibited those uses outright in the I-1 zone. And so it would be helpful to go back and readjust. And also clarify some of the use types in the code. And that's not necessarily to take away from the industrial uses, but.
I think you'll see in subsequent slides that how staff's looking at that, and to refocus on potentially industrial sanctuaries, because in the I-2, for example, they're pretty compact and contiguous, that those may need some protection.
Mr. Flynn, anything else, sir?
Eventually, I'll let them talk some more. And then I'll
Ms.
have
Johnson?
questions.
I was going to help out here, but we'll let the staff keep going and.
Anything else, Ms. Emmy members, we'll continue? Please continue, Bill. Sorry.
No, no problem. Appreciate, no, all questions, appreciate it. So let me step back one second before I move forward and reiterate something that we talked a little bit about in the last work session. When considering industrial land use policy directions, it's going to be important to take a look at policies very specifically that address maintaining and increasing the supply of industrial sites and land in the Bolin and Shugiak Eagle River. But the other side of that is dealing with the issue of competing demand, demand for land that might very well be better for industrial, but for price reasons or whatever, development cost reasons, it's going into different uses when some policy tweaks could probably help prevent that. So it's a supply policy, and this is part of the supply policy menu toolbox that's been discussed. The next slide has to do with policies more along the lines of dealing with industrial demand and non-industrial demand competing for or driving up costs for industrial users and outbidding on sites. Again, the Technical Advisory Committee pretty much agreed, in particular members who deal with land and land transactions quite a bit. Again, because of the cost to develop industrial land, the unique the unique natures of each site and each user, and how they really can't build up. They're the most industrial land users are the most vulnerable for land to be converted to other use, and therefore dwindling supply of appropriate sites. And the other side of it is that the economy is complex, your industry mix is varied, but there are industries here that what we would call traded sector industries, that all businesses are valued in Anchorage and in Shugiak River, but some do far more business with customers outside of the Anchorage region and bring dollars back home, while a lot of businesses do far more business with each other within Anchorage. And in part focusing on industrial land policies that really try to help ensure sites for those businesses that do a lot of business outside of Anchorage and bring money back in. From an economic standpoint, that should be part of the mix when you consider policy for how much land to maintain and sites to maintain, and for what type of industries you want to encourage to grow here. So, not to say that businesses are all valuable, but there are some sectors that are really key to generating jobs here for the business they do elsewhere and bringing back commerce. So again, that's what we consider the traded sector industries. That's how in economic development parlance, that's the term for it. The next step really that we recommend from a supply standpoint, but helping to ensure sites for maintaining industrial land demand is going through, the committee agreed and recommend going through a process of just taking a look at where your lands are. They're currently zoned, or they're appropriately located given what your infrastructure investment is, given what the surrounding businesses are, what the existing use is. And perhaps there are areas that just are not appropriate to be zoned industrial, and long term there should be thought about where industrial really is going to continue to occur and where it's not. So being a bit more forward-looking given what you currently see and what you currently don't see. And then once you have a better understanding through that process, the committee, there was agreement on the committee basically, and particularly emphatically from one committee member in general, that taking a look at existing industrial areas, not necessarily industrial areas that currently don't have use in place on sites, but areas that are truly existing industrial areas based on your review, there are going to be some of those areas that should be worthwhile considering for some sort of sanctuary or strong protection. The obvious case in my mind is, and this project isn't part of the process, but the obvious example, for instance, in the future is Ship Creek area. That would probably be a low-hanging fruit regarding thinking about strict policy long-term to maintain the industrial sanctity of the area. But it's going to get trickier in other parts of town. But certainly that sort of an approach is common with other jurisdictions that have gone through the process of competing land use and scarce sites. So it's part of the common toolbox regarding that. And so you're just protecting encroachment of other uses and changes in land values, preventing traffic conflicts that are not helpful to certain industrial users and districts, that sort of thing. The next piece, what we heard was, what we heard, when I talked about the process of how the study went, and how the commercial land study process went, in terms of identifying the different sites in the area and land supply in the area. Members of the Technical Advisory Committee who go through the process of trying to do the same thing for clients and take a look at industrial sites potentially for development, or taking a look at, like AEDC, looking for sites for potential businesses looking to expand or what have you. There was kind of agreement on the private and public side that a GIS-based database that can be accessed by both parties that would facilitate far more comprehensive information about your land use inventory and its qualities, individual site qualities, would be highly useful. And we even heard interest in potentially in a kind of a fee-for-service type approach on the private side to access that information. But as you move forward with things like the marijuana industry and you move forward with your land use plan map process, a system like that would be similar to elsewhere that's gone through the process and would enable just far better information about what you have, what you don't have, where it is, what its infrastructure is, what its value is, and all of that. It would reduce cost and time on both the private and public side, certainly, for future efforts. Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm wondering, does the muni, are we set up to do a GI-based, land-based database? Should we do that ourselves, or would we have to subcontract that out?
We created it for the study. The study was originally intended to last about 6 to 8 months of work. We're going on 2 years. And the primary reason is because our previous database is 20 years old. And we darkened the doors of hundreds of businesses to try and determine what makes, what industrial sector they're working for. The challenge will be to, I believe, will be to maintain that over time, or figure out a way that the community can overall maintain and build on that.
Mr. Chairman, the Center of Excellence for GIS really has this under its belt now. We have the underlying layers. It's a matter of prioritizing the project to get it in the queue to develop this company. We can do it all in-house.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions from some members? Yes.
Yeah.
Still.
As we're going through this, something, crop up. We're punching through 100th and Dowling. What kind of pressures does that put on the remaining industrial lands in those areas? I mean, transportation is necessary for any use, I suppose. But are we chopping it up and making it more susceptible to commercial use or housing use as opposed to industrial land?
That gets to one of the outcomes of the Title 21 rewrite. That area is actually set out in code for a look at its future land use pattern. And it might be a topic that we attempt to address during the land use plan map update for the bowl, is to try and determine what will be the impacts of new infrastructure in that area. There's also, extension of sewer, water.
The answer to your question, Mr. Steele,
Yes.
is Now that we're sorting roads in there, they're going to say, hey, we want commercial, even though the public is paying for the improvement, and it might be better as industrial.
Or commercial.
But that was what I was afraid of.
Yeah.
As a comment on Mr. Flynn's comment,
Jump in, Mr. Potter.
well, one of the key things to remember here is that there are properties that have significant issues associated with their development and a high cost. So when you're thinking about that area specifically, yes, the public is paying for 100th Avenue. The sewer has been paid for by private sector, which wasn't supposed to be the case 30 years ago, and that was always the plan, that it would be a public extension. And that property, I think, is probably one of the better examples of those that are so expensive to develop. There's not an industrial use or user that can spend the money to develop it.
Exactly.
And there you go to maybe some of the industrial zone properties just in the wrong place, and you would shift that to commercial and then make sure that you set up some other sanctuaries for industrial.
But where? I mean, that's their,
Well,
I think Bill's going to get to that a little bit.
we are focused on that area, and the update to the land use plan map, when 100th does go through, it's bubbled in Title 21 that was adopted for us to go in and look at it further, which we've done and we're doing. So when you see the land use plan map, there will be some suggested changes in that area.
Anything else?
There's,
Go ahead.
there's some municipal-owned land there, 92nd and Arctic, I guess, owned by was designated as a school site. But there's also some other municipal property there. And it was always stated that the limitation is the peat in terms of development.
And also, the properties that we're acquiring for the wetlands mitigation bank to the north of 100th.
So we're trying to hang on to those properties as opposed to divest ourselves.
That whole subdivision to Laurel Acres, well, there's 130 some odd parcels that we've already acquired. JL's acquired some, so they're all going to, the majority of that subdivision will be a wetlands mitigation bank. There's quite a few changes going on in that area.
And those municipally owned properties, I know you're very far away, but this yellow square here, that indicates those properties were recognized as part of a potential industrial lands in our land supply analysis. The yellow means they are environmentally constrained in some way, probably the wetlands.
Bill, you want to continue then?
Too much.
Let's get the marijuana issue coming up.
There you go.
Since I've got our marijuana chairman here, we'll talk about it. I would eat brownies from you, but no.
And very quickly, this would be more in partnership with AEDC, most likely. But there would be value in, as you go through the process of land use plan map in particular, and trying and taking a look at what you have and what you don't have more formally as part of the balance process. Really kind of going through and identifying some key sites, whether it's 5, if you have them, up to 10, maybe of different sizes, and best understanding what infrastructure you have there, what you have to offer, so that you can have some kind of quick trigger sites for reason for kind of quicker investment or development decisions. And as you consider policies for protection of industrial land in certain areas, or what policies you do end up adopting, putting force behind keeping those particular sites insured for industrial user expansion, new business or existing that wants to stay or expand. Okay. Marijuana industry. So, yeah, no, I've been going through and pulling as much information together as I can about specifically the Denver marijuana industry and what we can extrapolate from it about what it might mean for Anchorage in terms of industrial, particularly industrial space need. We can translate that into land or site need fairly easily. It's kind of an ongoing process. There's a broker in Denver that, for whatever reason, has ended up handling most of the transactions. And he's a very busy fellow, and I've not been able to actually talk with him, but I want to interview him about a particular topic, especially, and I'll get to that in a moment. But first off, if you compare MSAs, and Anchorage MSA versus Denver's MSA, just in terms of total population and total tourism flow, the Anchorage MSA market, including the Matsu Borough, is really about 20% the size of Denver. So when you think about the numbers that you've seen of what's going on in Denver in terms of the marijuana industry, the first kind of reduction, or at least kind of comparison reduction that we need to think about is about a 20% reduction based on how much smaller, what fewer people there are here, even though the tourism industry is huge here and comparable to there, certainly. Different traffic flow right now, but in terms of numbers, it's really an 80% reduction. So that's kind of the first comparison. The numbers coming out of Denver in terms of the commercial real estate brokerage firms, after reviewing some of their reports, the low-end estimate right now for demand for industrial space in the core Denver area market is about 4 million square feet. There are other transactions going on that probably are due to some sort of aspect of the marijuana industry. But right now, the low estimate so far is about 4 million square feet of industrial space absorbed due solely to these businesses related, whether they are growing and harvesting, processing, or value added across the board. The space that ends up getting leased up, taken up by these firms, are typically older, vintage, low-cost warehouse industrial space. I have to say, anecdotally, I know some brokers who are beginning to field that in the Portland area, and it's very similar. Older, very cheap, flexible use space, older warehouse space. And part of the reason is because the plants themselves can be grown very space efficiently, very vertically. Number two is because power cost is such a high part of the manufacturing process that, again, with industrial, space costs need to be as cheap as possible because of all the other inputs, the cost of manufacturing. So now that's the type of space that's being used, existing lower cost space. There's new construction going on of facilities, steel buildings and such that can take the humidity of the environment, growing environment inside. But by and large, so far, it's been the nooks and crannies of the old warehouse and manufacturing space. Geographically, based on all of the information we have so far, is that the city of Denver itself, Denver proper, is capturing about half of that demand, half of that absorption of space by manufacturers and whatnot. And the suburb of Aurora to the immediate east, where the old Stapleton Airport used to be, that's because of all of the old warehouse space related to transportation and airfield from long ago. That's really where it's concentrated. It's the east side. There's a lot of existing freeway, because of the old airport, existing freeway transportation infrastructure as well. So,
Mr. Johnson has a question.
Sure, no problem.
On this point, are they the same power grid, same power cost?
Yes. Yeah. It's a matter of finding just the right spot, given that, exactly.
Just continue, Bill, sorry.
Sure, no problem. Appreciate the question. The big question that I, in terms of trying to extrapolate for Anchorage versus what's going on in Denver, the $20 million question for me, in order to giving a final, as educated as possible guess for you about what type of industrial space and land need will come from this industry, has to do with the question of there's evidence, but not convincing evidence. I want to get better information. That there's a lot of investment going on in facilities in Denver speculatively for broader legalizations. Denver's location at the intersection of two major interstates, it's central location for the Rocky Mountain West, over the Pacific and in the Midwest. It's a fantastic location to be a central manufacturing and distribution location. Some of the magnitude of what's going on there right now is speculation about future growth and transportation of goods elsewhere, manufacturing and transportation elsewhere. To the extent that that's happening, Anchorage's isolation, you wouldn't see that effect. So there's an adjustment that needs to occur because of that in comparing the two. So going through all those points, and what we know now, the preliminary estimate based on comparable population or relative population differences, relative tourism flow differences, how much industrial absorption activities occurred, where it is, what kind it is, and how isolated or not the industry would be here versus what's going on speculatively to some extent in Denver. The estimate is between 150,000 square feet of industrial space, assuming that the industry is isolated in Anchorage and in Alaska, versus right now up to 350,000 square feet of industrial space, based on how much transportation there could be in the future outside of or to other parts of the state. But if the market's fairly self-contained in the Anchorage MSA, this is your low-end estimate. If Anchorage ends up being a center for the state for power cost reasons and such, you're looking at a bigger market. So looking at acreage, that's 15, 20 to 40 acres equivalent of land for that amount of space for industrial use.
So you would bump up your demand estimate by that amount?
Exactly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just looking at further up on the page here where it said that Denver was going to be using somewhere near 4 million square feet. We're 20% somewhere around the size of Denver. So 20% of 4 million would be 800,000 square feet. So your estimate of 150 to 350, is that lower because you expect there'll be more growing done in the valley because the real estate's cheaper?
Exactly. Some of it, roughly speaking, if we use Denver as the case study, cost of space is an important factor. Is an important factor. So right now, based on what we know, it's a 50% split. Exactly. Okay. Roughly speaking.
Ernie? Assembly members, any questions? Is the guard base still operational, or is it, who took over Coolest when the state shut it down?
I'm not certain of that.
International.
Because I'm wondering if that would be, as they did with Stapleton, would that, they've got hangars there, they've got the industrial space.
Has to be used for air.
I think they rented out those.
First priority anyway. Doesn't have to be.
FAA.
That's got to be the first priority.
A couple of questions, if I might.
Mr. Flynn, sir.
I see that Andy Donovan and Jim Cubitt served on your technical committee. How did you incorporate industrial lands owned by the railroad into this research? Are they classified differently than other industrial lands, or considered the same?
We included them right with the rest of our land supply. They're in there. We categorized the uses there just as we would the rest of the land supply, so that the uses there, vacant or potentially redevelopable lands, there are all the same. The technical leap we had to take is because the railroad has lease lots. They aren't platted lots. So our platted lots were of no use to us in trying to determine acreage or where these places were. But Andy, Donovan, they were kind enough to give us their lease lot information, and so we were able to create with our GIS analysis a pretend set of lots based on their actual lease lots. So.
And did you layer in the recently reviewed Chip Creek master plan into this? Because
Yes,
that seems to be sucking up a lot of industrial space.
That redevelopment mixed-use area would not include, according to the plan, not include a lot or any industrial. However, its plan is focused on an area which is already zoned planned community for mixed-use commercial residential. So that plan didn't really, for us, represent much of a loss of future industrial land base. There may be a few lots just to the east of the main part of that plan, but it was mostly focused in the west and the southwest corner. But I will double check that and make sure that plan did not, in its east end, take away anything that's already currently being used as industrial.
I've transloaded a lot of material on the west end of that plant.
Yeah, what we did find was that if there were one planned public improvement that would have an impact on the land supply is, were there to be a highway-to-highway connection, you're talking about a 300-foot wide transportation corridor. It has not been identified where exactly that would be, but, you'll see it in the transportation metro MTP and the existing, the concept would be to take it right north of 3rd. We did, in our estimates, deduct about 20 to 30 acres of industrial land supply in anticipation of that land.
Don't worry, DOT has completely destroyed highway to highway. So our only solution now is to buy Big Bertha from Seattle when they're done with her going to Merrill Field. So, just take it to the right landfill. The final question I had was, how did you account for step-down zoning for buffering industrial uses in this? Or did you?
We did not. Ours are averages over the whole Bowl and Chugiak Eagle River. So we did not take into account that buffering. Well, we believe that generally because the densities are so low in industrial, that it wasn't as if there were height limits that we anticipated would really limit the density, but I can double check the vegetation buffering requirements and see along those areas we've identified in our land supply where they abut residential, see what our current requirements for buffering would do to further reduce the usable area of those sites. Double check the vegetative buffering.
Well, it's more than that. I mean, go talk to QAP about how much work they've had to do to build berms to reduce noise associated with their gravel operations and their asphalt plant to protect the folks over at Fox Ridge. Dealt with that for years. Had cops climbing on locomotives.
No, it's a good question.
So, I'm very supportive of having a good industrial land base when we, are living with the sins of our past and never establishing a commercial buffer around them. And if we're going to have to do some of that in order to mitigate as we move forward, we need to think that through in terms of how it impacts our land base.
Okay. Anything else, Mr. Flynn?
I think that was everything I jotted down during the conversation.
Comments from assembly members? Bill, anything else, sir?
I'm concluding with that, just kind of where we are on this industry.
Okay.
So is that the end of your,
You got future slides. That is it. So I was looking at your handout, there's a few more slides after end of presentation. Your next one? At least in this handout.
These were reserve slides. We actually showed these in December, and were there in the event that you had questions on any of those topics, not to necessarily go over each of them with you. That's a more detailed look at our bull land supply than what the main slide showed. We did attempt to deal with what portion of future industrial development could occur as being intensifying existing industrial sites, because obviously there's room for growth on sites, and there are several different ways that we dealt with or would recommend dealing with that. But in general, in relative to multifamily and commercial, you can always go up with office. Technically, you can basically do multi-story. Once you deal with the financing and economics is a big hurdle here in Anchorage, particularly for multifamily. But essentially, industrial uses in Anchorage are likely to remain, one or two story uses. Physically, there just isn't the likelihood of being able to substantially increase efficiency of the site. However, I did notice that in Bill's report, he does anticipate a gradual increase in floor area ratio, the density over time, and so.
Ms. Johnston, ma'am.
So, in this analysis, have you done a sort of a cost benefit of needs and to the availability? I mean, I've dealt a lot, as you know, with 100 and C Street and some of the industrial folks there, and I look at that top slide and I think of one of them who actually feels probably his product is better in the valley anyways. And is it a product that, what is the best for Anchorage to be used for Anchorage and for South Central versus, what we're trying, as if we were an island. And is this part of your...
The analysis doesn't go into trying to assigning any value, any value metric, where you could try to balance that in a cost-benefit way versus other uses, for instance. But what we did try to do in terms of discussing why industrial is important, and then in some of the policies, like the very specifically identifying your traded sectors, and ensuring that at least those particular industries are the ones that you really can assure sites for. It's really kind of a matter of being judicious about your industries. There's nothing in the report that kind of gives you some sort of rubric to make those balancing, make those decisions. And ultimately, businesses like the one on the top, if they need to, they're pretty dense. That site's pretty densely used for what they do right now.
Right.
If they need to expand, land costs, even a suitable site for them would just be too expensive to buy just to store. They're going to move anyway. And it's not a matter of, as a policy, encouraging those folks to move, but just the economics of the situation are going to make that tough to expand here. But moving forward, you have other users where, if they're new types of seafood or recreation manufacturing equipment, those are the types of users that are probably selling to the lower 48 and elsewhere. And so keeping in mind an industrial land supply that can ensure that type of growth. It's about being judicious with your industries.
Your market is basically land value, production costs, and power, your energy grid, right?
Mm-hmm.
So as you're looking at that, you're looking at South Central, not just as Anchorage, but as the whole South Central map, and how we fit into those, transportation, four things. How we fit in and what are the immediate benefits and needs for Anchorage and South Central.
There's no.
What policy-wise we cannot afford to ignore is what I'm saying.
I think maybe it's elaboration on some of the policy recommendations having to do with targeted industries. That's probably the best direction to go, for answering some of your questions. So that we can certainly elaborate on that. But it's, I think rather than taking a look at the specific use of the industry, really kind of what the sector is doing for the economy. What's
around the airport? What's around the rails?
Exactly.
What is, as I say, the power grid is very important for Mr. Hall's industry. For Bud over here.
I thought he was in the furniture business.
I think get out of that.
But I'm just, as I say, I'm only going to be here another year, but as policy decisions are being made, I think that rubric or that has to be considered in this whole industrial survey. So, and that's kind of what's going in a haphazard way on CM 100.
Well, I think those 4 criteria that you spelled out there really are the criteria. There was, we elaborated on that it's all 4 of those things together is going to determine
Yeah.
which jurisdiction is going to receive which
Right.
type of industry.
And I'm putting them all together, I'm saying those are the 4.
I might add, the quality of the labor force nearby. So if you have markedly different labor force,
There's one other factor left out too, is the quality of life too. For those companies coming here, they're looking at the quality of life, the ancillary types of recreational things and housing opportunities, and, there's more.
Mr. Steele, sir.
What zoning is going to allow production of edibles or cooking or, you're going to have to look at all the zoning, look at that zoning ordinance and see
Just to give
where
you
the
an
sales
update,
were.
Well, just to give you all of an update, we're looking at all the other jurisdictions that have currently operating legalization. Colorado and Washington, we're putting, looking at their ordinances, and it all depends on how the regulations come out of Juneau and how they come out of the Anchorage Assembly of what's going to happen. But we're looking that retail will be retail, if it's allowed, in all the retail zoning districts, just like any other retail business. Manufacturing growing will be in the I-1 and the I-2, so the production and manufacturing will be in the I-2. Depending on how the regulations come out, does grow and sell have to take place in the same site? We're not, all these things are up in the air as to what's going to happen out of Juneau and out of Anchorage. But we've developed a GIS map to show separation differences between these zoning districts and potentially schools, churches, daycares, whatever the assembly decides it's going to, however it's going to regulate these. So we're gearing up to get ready for it.
And to tag on to Jennifer's, we've got three electric utilities within the boundaries of Anchorage, I guess. And if cost is going to be a factor, then they're going to look at those. But more importantly, it's who's got the electrical distribution network.
Well, it's good that Phil Steyer's here, because he spoke to it yesterday. I think it was yesterday. But, the electrical costs are cheaper in Anchorage than they are in Matsu. But the structures may be cheaper to buy in Matsu, so maybe they're going to balance those things out. But predominantly, I think you're going to see a lot of the activity happen here in Anchorage.
For ML&P, they're going to have to worry about where they're going to have to upgrade their system in order to take a high demand. I don't know if they are or not.
Well, you got plenty of capacity, don't you, Phil?
Actually, the power grid has.
You give them a
plenty of
marijuana
capacity.
special where you discount them on a power based on the product.
As I confessed to the committee, I'm not all that popular with some of my coworkers because I initiate these same discussions within our own organization. It does beg some questions about how this business is going to develop, and that it would be in front of it than behind. But I have checked with other utilities that have legalized operations, and they're chasing around upgrading facilities, because what happens is people move in to a space that had one use, and they're kind of just assume that whatever they do, the power will flow as they need, and yet the utility finds itself having to upgrade frequently to serve a much larger electrical demand within a facility. So it is going to be an issue for Chugach and ML&P and any other utility that has this load. And we had just the very briefest of discussions about whether it'd be good to try and plan for that in some way. But we have capacity, and some of the numbers are really pretty stunning when you look at how much power goes into a pound of marijuana. Yeah.
With generation,
Continue to upgrade now. The company folds, and then you've got all that excess capacity right there and no demand for it.
That is one of the issues. At least one utility told us they got caught flat-footed not having tariffs in place to charge the customer driving the demand for the new service. And so it's the kind of thing we need to make sure we're ready as well. So.
Any questions from assembly members? Thank you, Phil. Anything else from the body? Thank you for being here.
And Tom says we'll all get the draft report.
All these maps are going to become available. Bill's report here is backed by something you will also receive when this is final. It's our 200-page report entitled Much Ado About Nothing, a report on Anchorage's industrial land supply. But it has all the maps and all the analysis available, and they will be together. But I would call your attention to just inside the report you have, inside of the second page, that is a list of our committee members who have given their time, and you can see who is involved. One of them is sitting beside you, so Ernie. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you guys very much. Bill, thanks very much for being here involved with this. Appreciate it. That's in the meeting. Thank you for being here today.